so excited to moderate this panel this morning. We have a fantastic mix of papers looking at past, present, and future of audience, of representation, and asking some really important questions around how the news media represents different constituencies and for whom the news is produced. I am going to let each author or set of authors briefly introduce themselves, because you will all definitely do a better job than I would this early in the morning. But before I do that, I just want to go over a couple of quick logistics. We have an hour, and I do want to leave time for questions, so I'd like each paper to try and keep things, 10 minutes, if that seems reasonable. I will run a timer. My students call me the enforcer on this kind of stuff, so please do try and stick to that. And then just really quickly, for anybody presenting, is it anybody's first academic conference presenting? It's yours? Okay, first. All right, well, welcome. I made the transition from industry to academia, so I remember being a little nervous, and you're going to do great. All right, fantastic. So we're going to go down the list as given to me. So that means, Alyssa, you are going to start first. And Alyssa Smith is presenting a paper called An Annotated Dataset of U.S. Transgender News for Determining Agenda Setting and Information Flows.
Okay, thank you all so much for being here. I'm Alyssa. I'm a PhD candidate at the Network Science Institute at Northeastern. And today I'm going to be talking about building an annotated data set of news about trans folks in the US. And we've been using a less fancy version of this data set to determine agenda setting and information flows. So I'm going to walk you through some of our preliminary work and then tell you the fancier stuff that we're planning on doing later on. And my co-authors are Sagar Kumar. Sagar is going to be the lead author on building the data set, so I'm just here presenting. We've got Yukun Yang and Pranav Goyal, all of whom, if you know them, they've done amazing work on this project, so tell them great job next time you see them. So just a quick outline of what I'm going to be talking through. We've got our motivation and background. We're going to talk you through some of the current findings in the first stage of our project. Then we'll tell you about our annotation method we're using, and tell you why it's useful and the future work that we plan to do to make this a useful annotated data set. So without further ado, let's jump into motivation and background. So first of all, we know quite a few things about the state of US news about trans people. First of all, we know over the course of maybe the last 5 or so years that attacks on trans rights are increasing. We also know that coverage of trans issues in US mainstream media is often problematic, and we'll dive into an example of that in a couple slides. But suffice it to say that the coverage is often exploitative, sometimes misgenders folks, and generally uses a lot of harmful tropes. And finally, we know that news coverage sets the agenda for public discourses. So the things that we talk about in the news and the way that we talk about them influences what happens in our legislatures, in the ways that people understand trans people and think about them. So the way that we understand our news coverage, the way we make sense of what's going on in the news, and the way that we can maybe nudge the news in a better direction is also incredibly important. So let's go through a quick example of some news about trans people. This is from a series of stories about an incident in a Colorado school system where the school created a quote-unquote secret club to educate middle schoolers about LGBTQ+ identities. And the kids were allowed to not tell their parents that they were going to this club for obvious reasons. The way that these stories tended to be framed in the news was basically saying, oh my God, this is a secret club. They are indoctrinating our children. This policy that lets trans kids be called by their chosen name and pronouns at schools is dangerous. It's undermining parental rights. So what we see in terms of framing in these articles is that the parental rights framing robs queer youth of agency, first of all. So these kids know who they are, and their parents might be trying to send them to conversion therapy or something, and these articles and the way that they're framed rob these youth of their agency and their own self-knowledge, their ability to define who they are as a person. Also, The act of tying youth education on these LGBTQ+ identities to indoctrination feeds into harmful tropes that we've already seen quite a bit in the news and in mainstream discourse about LGBTQ+ people. So that's a quick example of what the coverage in our data set looks like, because this is an actual example from the data set in the paper that we have currently in progress. However, and sort of foreshadowing the data set that we're going to be building, figuring out these tropes, pulling them out of the data set, and understanding the framings is not something that's super easy to do computationally. And I will walk you through these, what we were able to find computationally, but I want to use this as an example to motivate the data set that we're going to be building. So let's jump into our current findings. So we looked at the information flow between 2 national outlets and 6 state-level collections of local media. We used transfer entropy, which is a measure of drivenness, to figure out how coverage of a topic by, say, the New York Times was driving coverage of that same topic in California. What we found is that information, generally speaking, flows from national outlets to local ones, which is something that has been found in the literature quite a bit beforehand. We often see a national to local information flow. But there's a catch. It's not a direct one-step flow. Instead, we often see 1 or 2 local state-level collections mediating the information flow on a particular topic. So it's not a simple one-step national to local information flow. And I'll walk you through one of the plots we produced to talk through like what exactly is going on and how do we know what's going on. So transfer entropy is a measure of causality, and I see this got kind of squashed, so bear with me. But this is an illustration of the 2-step flow pattern that we're dealing with. So really quick, brighter colors mean more drivenness, and the vertical axis is driving the horizontal axis. So the first thing we're going to look at is the national to state information flow. And we can see that Fox News and the New York Times, which are 2 national level outlets, have a lot of bright spots for Florida and Ohio. So this means that Fox News and the New York Times are driving Florida and Ohio, and they're driving the other states much less so. And then if we look at the top left corner, we can see that Florida and Ohio, you can see those 2 very bright yellow bands for Florida and Ohio, are then driving all of the other states that are not Florida and Ohio. So that's how we uncovered this 2-step flow pattern using transfer entropy. And we can see that there's not a whole bunch of appreciable national to national flow, and the state to national flow is pretty jumbled and tends to be much lower. So overall what we found is that there's a 2-step flow mediated by Florida and Ohio. So it's not a simple local to national flow. And we hypothesized that one of 2 things could be going on. The first is that the methods we're using are a little bit more sophisticated than simple measures of causality. So we might be finding more fine-grained results than people have been able to find earlier on. Or this is unique to news about trans folks. Now the final thing I want to talk about and sort of foreshadow our data set is that the topic model we were using, latent Dirichlet allocation, or LDA, is good for spotting broad topics. As I hinted at before, this isn't so great for spotting subtle biases and tropes like the ones we saw in the introduction. Humans are needed to do this work. So what I'm going to be introducing today, and the project that we are currently working on, is building a human annotated trans news data set. We're using a framework called Deluge, which uses probabilistic inference techniques to efficiently produce human-generated taxonomies of labels for text data sets. It also allows for probabilistic accuracy, so crowd workers are allowed to be imperfect, and we can still get useful annotations from their work, as long as they're putting in some amount of effort and making a couple mistakes here and there. And we can also tune the number of queries we make to our expected accuracy of the crowd workers. So the way this works is first we ask our crowd workers to suggest a label for an item. So we give them a news article, we say, what item would you give this? We then ask the workers, a different set of workers, to select the best label for an item out of some small number of choices. And then we ask them to categorize. So we ask the workers to choose which labels, out of some number of choices, best applies to the item. And when we do this, we're able to build a taxonomy of article labels. So we can say, oh, this particular article falls under this category and this subcategory. And we also are able to use human annotators to pull out more subtle tropes and biases that are unsupervised, not a human, not very fancy topic model is not necessarily able to do. Overall, we're planning to finish our sandbox testing, and we finished our script writing in September. We're going to complete the full pipeline testing and publicize the tasks on Mechanical Turk in October 2024. We're going to finish our data collection and produce summary statistics in November, and then release the draft data set on the social media archive in December. We're going to use this to, thank you, to build, we have our taxonomy of human-generated thematic labels, and we're going to make this publicly available for journalism research. This is going to be an annotated data set to help us study intermediate agenda setting around trans issues and help us compare topic modeling output, which is our previous output, to these human-generated labels, and that will help us evaluate computational labeling systems. And this work is supported by a NetSeed research grant from the Network Science Institute. Thank you all so much. You can email me at my email address or talk to me after this, and I would love to take questions. Thank you so much.
Hi, welcome. My name is Eliza Mitova. I am from the University of Zurich, and the previous conference, Computation Journalism conference, was in Zurich, so I decided I missed that one, so I'm going to be here. So I have a bit of a different focus. So I'm a social scientist, so I come from a very social science background. And I will talk about news personalization. You all actually know news personalization from social media and from other services when services use algorithms and AI to personalize one's experience based on previous consumption. And in my dissertation, which I'm presenting today, I focus on news recommender systems, which are also referred to as news personalizations. These are systems that can be algorithmic or AI-driven, and they filter, recommend, prioritize, and sort news content based on different criteria, such as users' previous consumption and behavior. And news organizations worldwide are actually increasingly experimenting with news personalization and use it on different website sections, such as the home page or in different other For You sections. And they use different input and filtering approaches, which I will not be talking about as I am here as a social scientist. So why is it relevant that we study these systems? It is important because if news organizations increasingly focus on what audiences want to read about, and if the curation and distribution of news is personalized, this can actually mean that news organizations, mostly on the supply side, focus on reporting on what people actually want to read, and this can have broader implications on the supply side. On the audience demand side, when the distribution of news and the curation of news is optimized from preference matching, this can also have implications for people's exposures to challenging information. So it also has implications for the audience demand side. And we see that these two sides, the journalistic supply side and the audience demand side, they're in a way linked and interwoven. And these systems, news personalizations, and news recommenders, have implications for the maintenance of a diversely informed democratic citizenry. This is why I studied them in my dissertation. So this short presentation encompasses 5 published papers that I've published together with my co-authors from different universities, such as the University of Amsterdam. So first of all, we looked at how news professionals assess and perceive these systems and how they adopt them and what challenges they face. Then we focused on how users assess these systems and how these assessments relate to different individual characteristics and other preferences in international comparison. And then third, we also looked at how these attitudes align or misalign. one way to model these patterns, which I've briefly talked about in my submission, is the 4 A's matrix, which, because I timed this presentation for 12 minutes, I will just very briefly talk about that. So the 4 A's matrix kind of looks at the interplay of different A's in complex media systems, such as actors, so everyone who's involved in the design of these systems. Then we have the actants. This is the technology itself, so the news recommenders themselves with their affordances. Then we have the activities, so all journalistic activities within news organizations that shape news, the decision making, and how these systems are adopted. And then of course we have the audiences, that not only the actual audiences but also the imagined audience, because how news organizations perceive their audiences necessarily implicates how these systems and how journalism as a whole is shaped, and this is how we can model it. This is what I did in my dissertation. I tried to specify the relationships between these 4 A's and to extend this matrix. To answer the research questions, we first conducted qualitative semi-structured interviews, and here I come up with a very European focus, that we focused on news organizations in Switzerland and the Netherlands, and talked to different news professionals. And then on the demand side, we here included actually the US among other countries. So, and we studied how audiences international comparison perceive these systems. Let's look at selected findings that might be of interest to you here in the US. So organizations as a whole are very cautious about adopting personalization. They have nuanced audience perceptions, so in a way they believe that news audiences want personalization, they want to have these systems employed, but they also know audiences want something else from journalism than from social media. The news organizations face various user-centered and producer-centered trade-offs. On the one hand, they believe audiences may want these systems. On the other hand, they struggle a lot with financial resources to adopt them. This is why they also face different challenges and have to, in a way, mitigate different viewpoints on the tech, on the business, and on the journalistic side. And, however, they find ways to mitigate these conflicts within news organizations. On the demand side, we see in international comparison, people generally have positive attitudes towards news personalization, but this varies across topics. So people do not necessarily want news personalization when it comes to the homepage or to politics. They see many benefits, but also see many risks and higher risks, and they want features of responsible NRS. So they want diversity, they want transparency about how these systems are adopted, and they want options to control these systems and their outputs. And this is an interesting finding. So when people believe that news media are already adopting news personalization already in an extensive way, they have lower trust in these media organizations that they believe use the system. So this is a very important finding. And we see some variation across country context. So coming to the areas of misalignment, so users and news workers agree that some sections, such as politics, such as breaking news, such as economics, should not necessarily be personalized. So we see some areas of alignment in that regard. Users and news professionals across business, tech, and journalistic divisions agree that these systems have many risks, but may also be beneficial, and both news professionals, even if they're tech people, if they're business people, they agree that these systems should be designed in a responsible way and should still expose you to challenging information and not just personalized based on your previous news consumption. But we see also some areas of misalignment. So contrary to what news professionals believe across tech, business, and journalistic divisions, users do not, even though they're quite positive towards the system, they do not necessarily desire personalization for news, even on social media. And what we heard from news professionals, they say news personalization and AI technology should not impact trust because the content remains central. What we're changing is just the background or just how it's distributed. This is not necessarily the case, as I showed in the previous slide. And as I don't have any time for that, I managed to specify these relationships between the different A's that I had in my presentation, and we see this is all embedded in depending on the meso-level factor and macro-level factors. And then moving to practical recommendations, so we believe news organizations should continue investing in responsible personalization and responsible AI use, and generative AI use, should be attentive when using personalization on the homepage and sections like politics, and very importantly, increase algorithmic knowledge among journalists, because we see that there is a lack of knowledge among journalists for how these systems are adopted. And we also believe that the government and educational institutions will also have some responsibility in that regard. And I'm going to skip that because of time constraints, but we believe there is, of course, now moving to generative AI, there is a need for more research on generative AI and how it's adopted and how it's perceived by news organization. And just concluding, so this news personalization is not a black and white phenomenon. We see benefits, we see concerns, but we still have to deal with how it's responsibly designed. And this is why I believe we need, going forward, we need to stay true, as a social scientist, stay true to theory-explicated approaches. So we have to integrate theory and not just look inductively at these systems, and we need new approaches, theoretical and methodological approaches. And I thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you for having us. We're all journalists, so thank you for welcoming us in. So we're talking about missing in Detroit, and every day 9 people are reported missing in Detroit. Far more go missing, 9 people are reported missing. As a news organization working for the Detroit Free Press, where I was an executive editor, we faced a challenge. Largest newsroom, largest staff in Michigan, yet we could not report on all of them, so we would write on some. You've seen this a lot in news media. We're looking at the anomalies, some socioeconomic factors though, such as race, gender, education, age. All of these elevate coverage of some over others. The other choice is we might write about none, or we write about some, but we definitely don't go to all. So I'm Anjanette Delgado. With me is Kristi Tanner and Stephen Harding. We are so excited to be with you today to talk about the careful considerations that newsrooms have to go through in reporting about complex subjects using automation and AI.
And this slide is just a quick slide of 911 calls in Detroit, but basically as an introduction, emergency calls to 911 affect for missing persons impact the entire city of Detroit, all neighborhoods, right? And you'll see some larger dots here. Just a basic map. Like this is a hospital. It's Henry Ford at the Lodge near Wayne State University. There's a hospital. It's a little bigger dot on the west side, and you can see St. John here, and this is the VA Medical Center. So sometimes there's more calls. These are just calls, just to give you some context about actual reports. Next slide. Here's some numbers. On the first slide, Anjanette had mentioned that on average 9 people are reported missing per day. Those are actual reports that we're aware of from DPD. Here's the numbers. They're usually updated every Friday, sometimes late. It was not updated yet this morning when I looked. So those are the raw numbers, about 2,600, actually not about, 2,637 missing persons reported as of a week ago on Friday. In general, there's about a 9 out of 10. They use the term recovery rate online. That means a person is alive and well, according to DPD sources. And currently, as of last Friday when I had the data updated, there's an active 307 missing persons. So as the media, in some cases, I'm sure you're aware, as users and readers of the news, is that sometimes we get reports from the police departments when there's an elderly person, when there's a juvenile, any case that subjectively or objectively, depending on the DPD's criteria, that a case is serious, it gets forwarded to us. So we don't get all the missing reports. We in the media get a subset. Okay, so I can't speak to the 307. I can speak to the 390 that we received by email as of yesterday. Next. Here's an example of some missing persons posters that we get. This is the later style that just happened this year. Both of these individuals have been found. This individual, if you'll note here, it's very small, but if you'll note here, there's a stigmatizing term. They used to use the word suppers. And we've had conversations with them, and now they use has. So they're changing. We've had a lot of conversations with mental health professionals, not just in Michigan, but also internationally, about ways to change wording when reporting before creating a record for an individual. And so we've been in conversations throughout the year trying to work on this project. And some of those requests we've asked, why do you use these terms? And they said, oh, we thought about that. We're going to go with your change. So we have had some minor impact on that area. Thank you. Second, we sat down with the Missing Persons Unit at DPD, Detroit Police Department, and asked them, why do you include all this language? Because these are all questions we get from editors. What's all this information? What should we include? What's harmful? What makes a vulnerable person more vulnerable about having that information in the media? What do we need to know to protect them and find them? This is the information we got from Sergeant Shannon Jones. She's one of the members of the Missing Persons Unit, and she said to me quite plainly, you're going to be wrong either way. You know, when if you need that information, we want to put it out there so community members know when they approach somebody to be cautious. I talked to Karen Shalev. She is a professor at the University of Portsmouth in the UK. She's a founder of the Missing Persons Research Group, and she suggested in this case, this is language from actual posters. In this case, this is the young woman who's she goes missing a lot. I know her case pretty well. She suggested in this woman's case that we can say in the media instead, she has multiple vulnerabilities, or she may be frightened if you approach her, like ways to sanitize the language. Next slide. So then we did all this work, and my colleague Steven's going to talk about all the tools that we needed to wrap our arms around all this information that we get, which is quite overwhelming as a reporter to keep up with this cadence of content. And we said, oh, we can do this. We can cover every person. This is great. We got everything together. And then I talked to Anjanette, and I was like, we just need to take a breath. Like, what happens if we do this? What happens if now we can do this, we have the tools, but what happens like to the people in the community? And she said, fine, which is very nice when you have that support, and usually it's publish, right? But she said, fine, let's pause. So we're pausing. And we stepped back and we did some research, which happens in journalism, believe it or not, right? So we did some research, and a couple things right away that hit me like a brick. Frequency, right, of appeals and the car alarm effect. And there's, sometimes missing persons research and prospective memory research is still kind of a new field. Ish, if you think about academia and literature. But this is pretty clear that in this case, in an earlier study, they found that their hypothesis was, and they wanted to test, is that if you have a lot of missing persons alerts, does it equate to the car alarm effect, right? Oversaturation, where you stop paying attention, it's less effective. Their research found this was true. For example, 3 times per week, if you get a missing person alert, which would certainly happen with our project, we at Go, it's more than 3 times a week. By the third one, you're less attentive. So we're doing more harm than good. I only have a minute. I gotta switch over. I'll skip some of the things. Increased image variability, really important for us. We only get 1 photo. It's very hard, and you'll see that. You only get 1 photo. So having multiple photos, obviously face recognition is different than word recognition, right? And I look very different, I hope, sometimes in photos. I see someone, well, that's not me. Digital footprint is also something we're thinking about here, unlike in the UK, where there's the right to be forgotten. When I create a record, we have a lot of young children that go missing very often. I see those in the alerts that get pushed to me because they're young children, right? So, there's a few cases we know very well. What if I make a record every time they go missing? What does that do to them, right? Yeah. So we've talked to other folks overseas about using possibly first name only of children, and also de-indexing other things, but I have to move on. Yes, go.
All right. That was triggered by some of the keywords in the emails that they would send, and that kicked off a process of adjusting the PDF. We used initially basic OCR built within Power Automate to extract the data, and then regular expressions to kind of pull it out. That got mixed results, so we turned to a pre-built AI model within Power Automate to grab that data. And this is a process of actually training it. So as you can see, it's pretty straightforward. You define your fields. You go through and you tag bits of the document that you want to extract. And so, in that way, it's a lot like machine learning. You're just kind of telling it which parts of the document to look for this data, and it extracts it. And that worked out pretty well in most cases. And just about anyone can do this. It's pretty accessible. Files, and so we'd have to create logic to deal with those situations to just focus on the missing persons files they sent us. And then, we also wanted to update our database with the missing people that were found, so we know, when they're no longer missing. So we built capability for that as well. That's an example of like the various flow, very small part of it. The exciting thing we're working on now is we're working with a partner to create a generative AI system that uses context to extract data from these missing persons reports. It's a lot more flexible than the system we originally came up with. It uses, and we also have an LLM that sits on top of it that we can query, so it uses GPT 4.0. And so we can actually make queries against the data in a conversational format. And so this is an example of just, conversing with it, querying, various queries, and it's very intuitive. So it remembers previous responses, remembers previous questions. You don't have to rephrase the whole question over again. You can just say, reference something you asked earlier, drill down on specific things. And then finally, each of these data sets that we're building, missing persons is the first one, we have an API that can plug into a variety of visualizations, analytics, what have you, very flexible. So what I learned during this process is that the process of automation is actually a lot easier than it used to be. There are a lot more tools out there available to do this. We have ChatGPT, Copilot to fill in the blanks of knowledge, ask it a question about how to do something, it'll tell you. And then, conversely, it takes a lot of effort to make sure that the LLMs return good data. So you need to do a lot of prompts and then grounding truth so you know the answer to the question before you ask it. You compare it to what it's giving you, make sure that it's giving you accurate responses. That was really good because we had a subject matter expert in Kristi for this missing persons data. You want to talk about these last parts?
Yeah, so really quick. So one thing I learned, it's great to have the support to pause, to not publish, even when you're in academia, publish your peers, right? So just to take a step back, evaluate, think about impact, talk not just to academics, experts, talk to your community, go to your neighborhood leaders, walk around and use those resources and be willing to change course, which we all know, adjust the plan when necessary.
And the final one is creating space for experimentation. And so all of this that you just saw came out of two things we were working on. One was just a simple NLG experimentation with a weekly jobs report in the business section. And then the other piece was we created a sandbox with the rise of AI. We said, how are we going to think about things and what can we experiment with? So it came out of those two things. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. It's me, Mohamed Salama. I'm a native of Egypt. I'm a PhD student at Merritt College of Journalism. And you asked us to introduce ourselves, but I want to make a confession before I start. I am a good husband. I wake up in the morning, I brush my teeth, I make a breakfast for two, for my wife Yara and her little dog Juju, and then I leave the house to face the brutality of the PhD and also to face the brutality of lynching, which is my topic of today. So I'm specialized into studying issues of high sensitivity, such as racial violence, conflicts, and war. And today I will be talking about lynching. I will not be telling you the whole story about lynching, but I will be just telling you a glimpse of lynching, because lynching is big. But for me, I'm having a limited scope. So today I will be investigating how the US press framed law enforcement during lynching, focusing on whether the press, I mean here white news accounts, was it neutral or not in its coverage of lynching in relation specifically to law enforcement. Because when we say lynching, we look for the factors. Why did we have such a rise of lynching during 19th century and to 20th century? Because one of the main factors is the failure of the legal system, and also in addition to other factors. So I will be giving you like a brief about lynching. So lynching, according to NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of People of Color, it says like it's a public killing of an individual who has not received any due process. These acts were typically carried out by mobs, often with a tactic or active involvement of law enforcement. And by the way, like I have did another paper like specifically on law enforcement, like, and the whole literature is like accusing law enforcement of like being complicit in such acts, or like at least like being failed in not preventing such a brutal killing. So lynching specifically, according also like to the literature reviews, they say lynching is like assassin phenomena. But it's not assassin phenomena. It's like a national phenomenon because like it happened in the West, it happened in the North, it happened in the Midwest, not just like in the South. But we have like big figures like Ida B. Wells. She's like a prominent black activist, and she was like very smart and very strategic in like making lynching, taking it to the national level. And she did like international like tours to London to also to bring the international attention. So I want to say, yes, lynching it happened in the South, but also we have other practices similar to lynching happened in the West against Mexicans, against Latinos, and against Chinese, and even Europeans, and even white Americans. So it's like a national thing. So we have also like, according like to the records, people have been lynched around like 4,000 to 5,000 because like there were like many cases, like many incidents were not documented because like we had two types of lynching. We had like a public lynching, and also we had a private lynching. And at the same time, like the press at the beginning like didn't give like attention to pay attention to such brutal acts, but later on the press was also complicit in such acts. We'll know later. So again, like African Americans were not just like the only main victim, but since they had like a big population, so they portrayed like as a big victim. But in my paper, I'm specifically focusing on African Americans. So when I say lynching, I mean like lynching of African Americans around different regions. So, but what else we should know about lynching? As I said, the press. The press, like, also like took part like in lynching. It was not an explicit part, but its coverage like led to the normalization of the brutal killing of African Americans, and also like because like I haven't like spent like 2 years like in digging into archives, with like I was like one of like the main extractors of news articles, and I found like many news pieces like encouraging people to participate in lynching, to watch and see. This way, or like this tactic, they wanted like to have it to legitimize such brutal acts. So come and see, to support your community, take the justice and protect your community. So the press played a role. So what is my argue? Like, how did the press portray law enforcement regarding bias or neutrality in historical coverage of lynching? So coming to the data collection, I would say like I'm a lucky person, because like this project is like part of like the original project. So the original project, we have access to 60,000 news pages we extracted from Library of Congress. We use like stratified sample, but using like a specific term, which is like lynching. It's like we collected all news stories that have a relation to a lynching activity, and then we had like another process of like extracting news pieces from these news pages. So far, we extracted like 7,000. Related news articles to lynching, and we are into the process like to maximize this number. But for my topic, for my current research, I'm like focusing on law enforcement. So I extracted all articles that have relation to law enforcement using specific keywords such as like sheriff, police, lawmen, etc. And this like take me like to have like 1,767 news articles. But as you know, data quality, it's like a big mess when you deal with historical archives, because like it's totally digitized. We have issues with OCR. So when I extracted the text and I converted to CSV. I had like a very issue was like I have fragmented lines, so I had like to aggregate, collect all these lines, and to split these lines to have like a logical sentences. And then my unit of analysis, after like I split it, the lines after cleaning the data, my unit of analysis like is the word. I looked for like the noun and the adjective, and here my noun is like the police, the sheriff, and the adjective, because like the adjective will help me to measure the tonality bias, and here if it's like neutral, if this adjective neutral, positive, negative, or not. And to do this, I did two main steps: dependency parsing, and this is like my main take, and then I did sentiment analysis. For the dependency parsing, like I looked for all relations. I looked for like synaptic relations between the noun and the adjective, and I looked for like two kind of relations: direct relation and indirect relation. One of these examples is like the direct relation. Here, like I'm having the adjective as a child and the noun as a parent. So I looked for like this relation, and after collecting all of these relations, I had to verify my model. So I did two main steps. First, I took a sample, and I tried like to annotate and to check the relations by myself and against my model, and I was like very lucky to have a compelling evaluation. And also like I did add another layer of like verification, so I did inner coder reliability, where I manually annotated the data against another coder, and also had like a compelling result. So for the sentiment analysis, then after collecting, I did sentiment analysis using Vadir. Vadir is good, but it has limits because like its lexicon. We cannot use it like for historical data. It's like more for modern data, but I used it. And this is like my main results, like it's neutral. We have some cases of positivity and some cases of negativity, but it was like neutral. But again, this is not like the whole fact. This is not the whole fact, because like we have to make interpretation to the data that we receive. So this is like an example: extra police. Extra is like neutral police. And we have like another brave police. Brave is like the positive and policeman. And we have weak and incompetent police, which is like the negative one. Limitations, again, algorithm bias. Vadir is good because like it could be like used across several domains, but it has like many limitations. Again, I'm also like having a lot of homework to do. So I'm into like the process like to build my own lexicon to be used for lynching, to be used like for hate speech, and that's shukran, and that's me. Shukran.
Okay, so I have questions for Alyssa and Mohamed. And I think one thing that I was thinking about when you were making your presentation is I've kind of covered a lot of like, anti-gender movements on the continent of Africa, and I see that especially as kind of like white evangelical Christianity in the US, and I also see that many, African media platforms are kind of patterning their information, along the lines of how US media is patterning anti-trans rhetoric, but also like anti-LGBT rhetoric much more broadly. And so I'm curious whether you've thought about like expanding, sort of see this like intermediate agenda setting functioning like continentally, and like how US media frames discourses elsewhere, and if there's any like future directions for work like along that line. And then for Mohamed, I was thinking precisely about there's this data set that you're talking about kind of says there's 4,500 to 5,000 cases of lynching between 1865 and 2020, and I'm wondering if that's also considering like police violence. It's like lynching of black folks, like this are all kind of like describe cases like Trayvon Martin and like George Floyd as lynchings as well. And so I'm curious if your data actually captures that as
yes. Okay, it spans from like 18th century to 2020.
Okay.
So yes, it includes them because like it included them according to the definition, because like the definition of lynching was like varying all the time until like in 2003 AACB agreed on like defining the definitions that I just displayed. So yes, they included according to the definition. So as long as you have a unified definition of lynching, you can have extra cases, because like there was like a big debate in the beginning when you get back to the literature, you found like, okay, I need to have a unified definition for lynching to know the difference between lynching and homicide. It was like, there's like intersection between homicide and lynching. So what does make lynching is like the definition. So when you have a unified definition, you can get like the actual number of this.
And Alyssa, do you want to weigh in?
I think that's a wonderful idea, and it sounds like you have a lot of domain knowledge. So if you would like to talk to our group at some point and think about a collaboration, I think that would be wonderful because I think there is a lot of room to study information flow internationally, and I think it would be honestly kind of boring to just focus on the U.S.-centered context and not as productive overall. So I'll try to gather your thoughts.
Yes.
I have one question for Alyssa and one for the Detroit Free Press folks. I'll ask the question first. I think I was interested in how you're explaining, or how you intend to explain the task of the annotations to the M-Turkers, because, you know, I feel like there's some risk there with, you know, people, randomly sampled people will have like certain biases or be not really aware of like how to interpret or like, you know, deal with news or language around trans folks. So like, how exactly did you, set them up to like understand the purpose?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually are building in qualification tasks, which is a pain in the butt to do with the Mechanical Turk API, but I think it's going to be worth it. We're actually making pre-screen tasks to make sure that people are reading the articles first of all, and then also providing labels that are not too general, not too specific, and not completely unproductive. So you have to pass the qualification task in order to be in the pool of people who are given tasks for our particular study. Thanks for asking.
Did you have another one too?
Yeah,
please.
For the Detroit Free Press database, I was curious because like you pointed out, you know, there's this number of reported incidents, but obviously much higher incidents in general. So like with your database, do you intend to allow for like solicitation or like, you know, members of the public who see the database to be like add, you know, their family member who has gone missing, etc.
So in this case, when we're building that technological database, so there's two different tracks. So as far as I'm on my team, there's a research track and a public service track. But yes, of course, like it's a great point that we are interested in talking to the community about missing persons. Part of the reasons why these projects are important to me. So I was working on a separate project about housing and instability in housing, and I had this several years ago. I could walk around knocking on a lot of doors. And a lot of the feedback from the community was not so much about who's living in the house next door, but they were talking about people that were missing, young women. A lot of concern about the lack of reporting on that. So that's definitely the direction that we want to continue and support. So it's a long process.
I have a quick question for Mohamed.
Yes, thank you.
So the paper's it's such an important line of inquiry. And you have my empathy with trying to use the Library of Congress newspaper collection. That is some awful OCR. But I just had a thought/question. Might this be an opportunity for some comparative analysis across the mainstream press and the black press during that time period? And I wonder, not that that's going to help your OCR problem, it might actually be a bit more challenging, but I do wonder, would you start to see a little bit more distinct results, differences in the sentiment analysis? And this is based on some anecdotal, just some things I've seen in my own qualitative research with the different corpuses. It might just be interesting to look at if you get sick of trying to get this one data set to.
This is like very small because like in our original research it would be like published like in few weeks, because like I just like finished like the review of the University Commons with my advisor. Okay. So we did like this comparison between like the black press and white press, but on the level of topics, not on the level of sentiment analysis.
Oh, okay,
so when we did it like on the level of topics, we found like the black press was like more into focusing on like lynching in terms of like relation to civil rights.
Okay.
Okay. So and they wanted like to amplify like the issue to the national level, and as I said, like also to the international level. But they were not competing against. But when it comes to the white press, they wanted like to to normalize the killing, to say, to describe like people like lynchers who like participate in such acts as best citizens, describing like what happens like in quiet mood. They killed him and lived quietly. So there was like a distinction between like the media coverage of, or like the focus of the white press and the black press. So yeah. But of course I will make it, this is like one of my homeworks that I need to do, to make this comparison between like the white and black in terms of like sentiment analysis. Thank you.
You often leave conferences with more work to do, so yeah. Excellent. All right, does anyone have any questions? Okay, there and then there, yeah.
I have a question for the missing persons talk. Great talk, by the way, thank you. I have a specific question about the data set part that is presented in the end, and I'm wondering if, like in the system itself, is there any way to ensure that the results that you're getting from the data set are correct and not predicted as the next token? Because like I use Claude and ChatGPT a lot, and some of these numbers are often imagined and not done using actual code.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So we went through a pretty lengthy process of prompts and parameters, and we're also using a very narrow data set. So it's really like, it's not being polluted by those other things that can cause hallucinations, and I think that's a really important way to go about something like this, is to take those very narrow and deep data sets and use those as like the database from which it's pulling, to determine things. The LLM was just being used to for textual context. So I think limiting the data to just what you want to look at is key for something like this.
I mean, this is more of a comment than a specific question, but I have found, at least when I upload large data sets, it starts hallucinating very much. So I found it to ask to read the data set and generate code to read the data set to be much more accurate, because then you're only running the code and not asking the other to do the math, in case that's ever used.
Yeah, that's fine.
We've got one more question, if you've got time, Jen.
Yeah, this question is for Alyssa, and I'm really interested in your project, and I'm like excited to see where it goes. And I guess what I was wondering is like, given some of the biases against trans people, I'm wondering if it makes sense to have people also read like a few other stories that aren't about trans people, just to kind of compare like, are they giving the same level of care to stories about trans people and stories not about trans people, or is that like not necessary given your like pre-screening process?
That might be a good thing to test when we're doing the keyword generation step, just to make sure. And I'll definitely float that to Sagar, who has been courageously wrangling the code behind the scenes. Thank you for that. Thanks.
Excellent. All right, we've got time for one more. Jeff, take us out.
Eliza, I was just, and maybe I just missed it, but I was curious if some of the papers detailed differences that you saw demand side, news audiences in Europe versus America.
In America, no, I mean, the comparison between the supply and demand side is not 100% possible, because we didn't interview organizations in the US, so we just interviewed organizations or people working in Switzerland and the Netherlands. So this comparison that I did, it was for my dissertation, and it was just an analytical comparison between these two sides, so extrapolating. But the direct comparison between supply and demand is possible only for Switzerland and the Netherlands.
All right, well, this was a fabulous, fabulous panel. Let's give another round of applause. And we have a 15-minute break between now and the next